To 1812 with Josh and Jimmy and the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel. This, of course, is Jimmy, wherever he is on the screen. And I am Josh. And today we are returning to the subject of the Russian campaign. And we have arrived at a place called Fili. It is the 13th of September, and over 80,000 men lie dead and wounded at the field of Borodino, and in a wooden peasant's hut on the outskirts of Fili, which is a village not far from Moscow. The High Command of the Russian Army is meeting for a council of war that will decide the fate of the campaign. Jimmy, over to you.
We find ourselves in Fili. How did we get to Fili? Well,
how indeed did we get to Fili? From the carnage that we witnessed last episode.
We've got to take into account of the fact that after the Battle of Borodino, we have several pretty key figures who are now missing. Not only missing, but some of them are dead. These include, in the Russian army, Prince Bagration, the commander of the Second Army, who had been mortally wounded at Borodino. It takes him 3 weeks to die, but he does eventually die to the the Russian army was left utterly distraught at that fact. And then, in addition to that, the commander of Third Corps, Nikolai Tuchkov, has also been mortally wounded, and he dies around the same time as Bagration. His younger brother, Alexander Tuchkov, also finds himself dead on the battlefield. His body never really seen, but we know where he fell because there is now a monastery on it. And apart from that, the dashing, young, brave artillery commander, General Kutaisov, also finds himself potentially blown to
atoms
because no one could find him. They could only find his horse,
which was
covered in a lot of blood.
Not good at all.
And so yeah, some of the leading lights of the Russian army, unfortunately, we have to bid farewell to. And it's not such a happy picture in the French army either. I mean, during the Battle of Borodino, actually, Marshal Davout was quite heavily injured, but fortunately for him, unfortunately for France, he managed to survive the action. Unfortunately for France, General Auguste de Caulaincourt, the younger son of Napoleon's Master of the Horse, found himself dead, having just captured the Ravsky Redoubt, and he had just replaced General Montbrun, the second Cavalry Corps commander.
Was he killed at Borodino too?
He was killed at Borodino too, yes.
Serious casualties amongst senior officers as well as men.
So Kutuzov decides to retreat from Borodino, and he ends up at this position called Fili, or half the position is at Fili. The other half is on the Sparrow Hills, where now you would find the Moscow State University, one of the 7 Stalin skyscrapers, and that hill backs on to the river Moskva, which is the namesake of the city of Moscow.
And of course, also now soon to be the title of Marshal Ney.
Indeed. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of Barclay de Tolly. So Barclay de Tolly has just retreated from Borodino. He's currently very ill. He believes he's essentially on his deathbed. He hasn't been wounded during the battle, but he's come down with this sort of headache, migraine, whatever you call it.
There was a lot of artillery at Borodino. I wouldn't be surprised if he had a shocking headache and was quite badly traumatized by the entire affair.
And also one imagines he probably did not have much sleep.
No.
So yeah, these things, even for the survivors, are going to take a pretty significant toll. Barclay is very ill, but he manages to summon the strength to inspect the position. When he does so, he's absolutely horrified by what he sees, and he goes up to General Bennigsen, the chief of staff, who has picked this position, and basically says to him, "What the hell are you doing, man?" And
is this a joke?
Have you basically decided to dig the grave of the Russian army here?
Because good work.
Yes. And he basically just lists a litany of things wrong with the position. Like I've said, the fact that it's covered in woods, the fact that you've got ravines sort of crisscrossing the field, the position. It's really difficult for the Russian units to communicate and to support each other. And you're in front of a river, so when things hit the fan, as they inevitably will, you've got no way of saving the army, because no matter how many bridges you have, and I think they had between 4 and 6, you're not going to be able to get so many men across.
Recipe for disaster.
And the army is going to be annihilated. If Napoleon hasn't been playing fruit ninja with it, cutting up the isolated units on the ravines. And Bennigsen is just like, well, we're in front of a river. We're in dire straits. This means that the men will have more courage. They're fighting a last stand, and they're gonna be able to. The morale boost is gonna more than compensate for the fact that it's not a great position. You're fighting for Moscow, and Napoleon is dead meat, I tell you. Barclay's not terribly impressed at this answer.
Napoleon's really good at fruit ninja.
So many sabers. I'm sure Murat would be amazing.
Oh yes, absolutely. We should make a fruit ninja with a cavalry saber.
Right. In any case, Barclay's not very happy with this, so he goes to the big man himself, Field Marshal Kutuzov, and he's just like, well, this guy Bennigsen here thinks that this position is somehow a decent position where we can have a decent chance of defending Moscow and of defeating Napoleon.
And for this reason, he should be committed to the nearest asylum.
or rather, he should be sent to take the waters in Carlsbad, or in some of the German bars.
Yeah.
Barclay basically goes to Kutuzov. We should reconsider fighting a battle here. And Kutuzov basically takes a look, gets a couple of staff officers to inspect the position and report back what they find. And they essentially share Barclay's conclusions. It's a terrible position. The army's going to get absolutely annihilated. And not only are you going to lose Moscow, you're going to lose the army as well. And Kutuzov just like, interesting. Let's have a chat about this in the evening, shall we?
Over some tea, and we'll bring out the samovar and whatever we eat with this.
This peasant hut, this humble peasant hut, serves as the headquarters of the Russian army, and Kutuzov gets all of them around the table. You've got Barclay de Tolly himself, still commander of the First Western Army. General Doktorov, Dmitry Doktorov, commander of 6th Corps. General Raevsky, Nikolai Raevsky, commander of 7th Corps. Uvarov, the cavalry commander of 1st Cavalry Corps. Yermolov, Barclay's chief of staff. Osterman Tolstoy, commander of 4th Corps. Kononvitsin, who has taken over from Nikolai Tuchkov as commander of Third Corps, Karl von Toll, who is the quartermaster general and therefore a senior staff officer. So those are the ones who are initially at the meeting, and apparently Matvey Platov, the Cossack commander, also arrives later, but we're not too sure. Kutuzov opens the meeting as befits the commander-in-chief, but he asks Barclay to set out his concerns about the position. Now, this is highly irregular with the Russian army because protocol in war councils dictate that the most junior officer would start talking in order to basically give them the chance to voice their opinions, I guess.
Indeed, because they're sitting with all their senior officers, so once the senior officer has spoken, that is essentially, unless he's asking for your opinion, that is the last word.
But the reason why Kutuzov asks Barclay to open is because Kutuzov, by this point, is already pretty much aware that this is not a very good position to fight in. And therefore, he's pretty sure that Barclay is going to advocate retreat. And he does not want other more junior generals to have the first word and basically all of them to say, oh, we must fight to defend Moscow. Instead, he wants Barclay to put out his position with the hope that some others will also be emboldened to support Barclay's thoughts. So Barclay again repeats what we've just said about how terrible the position is. The generals are deliberating, for a couple of hours. There's a pretty heated debate going on because a lot of the more junior officers do think that defending Moscow is the priority, and to give up the ancient sacred capital of Russia is too much. It's too much to bear.
Because even Kutuzov had promised Alexander that he wouldn't sacrifice Moscow.
Right, and obviously the Battle of Borodino had been fought in order to defend Moscow. Kutuzov didn't want to admit that objective could no longer be achieved. So they thought, as long as we can defend Moscow, then maybe there's a chance of essentially turning Borodino into a victory. So after Barclay has a spiel, they all have this great row. And then a couple of hours later, General Bienikson barges in and basically asks, do you punks really think that we should abandon this glorious ancient city, or we should fight like real men to defend our beautiful Moscow? And bear in mind, General Bienikson was born in Brunswick.
And yet
he has not a single drop of Russian blood in him, and yet he is making the case for defending Moscow, and basically saying, if we did not, what was the point of fighting the Battle of Borodino? What was the point of all that sacrifice we had made? Superficially, it's a convincing argument. Why are so many men gonna die in vain? But Kutuzov basically says that is not the question to ask. The question to ask is whether we should fight a battle from terrible position where the chances of success are minimal, or whether we should, with great reluctance, allow Napoleon to occupy Moscow. Bienikson is put in this place a little more when Kutuzov and Bienikson are basically having this massive argument now. And Kutuzov basically reminds everyone about an occasion when
in
the Russian army,
1807, I believe.
in 1807, when the Russian army found itself in front of a river, unable really to retreat. No. Friedland, I think that was called. And
it's something like that. Rings a vague bell.
does anyone around here know who commanded the Russian army at this point?
Someone who liked rivers a lot, I think.
So someone who spent a lot of time deciding that it was a good idea to fight right in front of rivers and not being able to retreat. And I believe it's the man I'm talking to.
Our friend Gönnigsen.
But this is still not enough to settle the matter. Gönnigsen basically suggests, okay, it's a terrible position, but why don't we go on the offensive? Why don't we catch Napoleon by surprise?
You'll never see it coming.
and we no longer have to defend a bad position. And I think Yermolov was like, yeah, not a bad suggestion. But Kutuzov wasn't having it. And eventually, they're arguing now sort of deep into the night. People are being really angry at the thought of abandoning Moscow. But Kutuzov basically just interrupts everyone and basically says, Napoleon is a torrent which we cannot stem right now. But Moscow is the sponge which will suck him dry. Prikazываю отступать. I order retreat. And
that's when the dramatic music begins, and
right. and the singing, the depressed singing of the Russian soldiers when they find out, the lament when they find out that their beloved Field Marshal Kutuzov has decided not to defend the mother city, but instead to let the Satak, Napoleon,
yes, the Antichrist, get his mitts on it.
But this is where actually Kutuzov makes his most brilliant and his most influential strategic contribution to the entire campaign. Because there's the question, fine, we'll abandon Moscow, but where do we go next? Some say maybe we should retreat northwards to block the path to Petersburg. Barclay de Tolly suggested retreating east to Vladimir on the Nizhny Novgorod road.
Which is another ancient city, isn't it? A lot of Russian heartland that direction.
Yeah, I mean, Vladimir itself was actually the capital of Russia prior to Moscow. He basically says, we'll get more space, and we have a bit of flexibility as to whether we should swing north to try to intercept Napoleon if he's trying to go to Petersburg, or whether maybe we can consider going south. And Kutuzov decides eventually to retreat southeast along the Ryazan road, and then to cut back towards Kaluga, which is going to end up in a sort of southwesterly direction. And Kutuzov, being the great strategist that he is, and no one should forget that, he is of the opinion that Napoleon very soon is going to find him and his men very hungry, and they're going to want supplies, and they're going to want food. And where in Russia is the most plentiful food? Well, it's in the southern provinces. And Kutuzov basically says Napoleon eventually is going to turn south, therefore we should be prepared to meet him there. And we should also get a bit closer to enjoy the supplies that we're going to be getting from the southern provinces as well.
There's also some depots and arms factories in that direction.
So the Russian army is going to get reinforced, and essentially it's going to wait. So you've got the Russian army retreating along the Ryazan road, and they are essentially retreating with quite a lot of the Muscovite population, because the decision to retreat was made pretty late, and although Governor Rostopchin had already made arrangements and some people had already left, it was still a scramble to get out. And you had the army and essentially civilians trying to get out, and with sort of carts and baggage trains and whatever.
And it's a big mess, isn't it? Because there's stores in the city that the army needs, and there's no carts practically to pull them out.
Right.
And there's barges being hauled into commission to pull stuff, and a lot of stuff has to be burned itself. Before we get too far on that, lots of supplies need burned to stop it falling into the hands of Napoleon.
Right, because these supplies which had been sort of painfully gathered by Rostopchin in order to supply the Russian army with, there's just no space for them, and they had to get rid of them quickly, and so it's complete chaos during the retreat. And General Miloradovich, who was not present at the Council of Fili, even though he is one of the more senior commanders, happened to be commanding the rear guard and was still fighting. And they were fighting the French vanguard under Murat. Miloradovich, basically, the main Russian army was still retreating.
Yes, there's a choice to be made here now, because you have the advance guard and the rear guard of two armies, and they have a city to contend with. What do two officers in that position do? They have two choices, basically. Three, maybe.
Well, so Miloradovich basically sends an envoy to Murat and basically says, "My dear Joachim, we've been fighting so long now. It's, so many people have died. It's been so terrible.
Grieves my heart.
You guys are on the doorstep of Moscow. We just want to get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
So why not give us an extra 12 hours so we can get out of here, and then you can get to Moscow, stay in Moscow, and do whatever you want with Moscow, because that's victory, right? That's victory. The Emperor says it's victory."
Yeah.
And Murat thought about it and was like, not sure about that, to be honest. I kind of still got orders to take
the place, beat you,
to pursue you and to cut you to bits. And
no, nothing personal.
Right. And Miloradovich. Now we've got to get into the mind of Miloradovich, because he is a dandy. He likes to dress in the most sort of ridiculous uniforms. He's a peacock. Yeah, he wants to show himself to his army and to his men and to the enemy, perhaps. Now, who in the French army reminds you of this?
Coincidentally,
who among Napoleon's marshals is the most
flamboyant,
exhibitionist? Let's
with
say
the curliest hair,
with the curliest hair and the featheriest hat. Miloradovich and Murat are essentially two peas in the pod. And Miloradovich, with his great sort of suave charm, basically goes to Murat.
We understand each other. I feel we have this connection.
If you don't agree to this truce, to this temporary truce, then we will fight for every inch of Moscow, and you better be ready for a complete bloodbath. And then Murat thinks about it, and it's just like, well, we've got Moscow. I don't want thousands of my men being killed. I don't think the Emperor really wants it. We're already losing quite a lot of men. So, all right, let's shake on it. We have a deal.
You have 12 hours.
12 hours to get the hell out of here.
Yeah, because Napoleon wants a triumphal entry, and you can't. You probably remembered Smolensk, which was pretty much a burning ruin, having fought for it, and obviously Murat was wanting some nice headquarters to sleep in that night. He was, as you said, he believed Napoleon when Napoleon told all his generals, once we take Moscow, the Russians will surrender.
Right.
So this seemed like the end.
Miloradovich was basically threatening to turn Moscow into an inferno, and no one wanted that to happen. So Napoleon arrives at the outskirts of Moscow, essentially at Fili, on the 15th of September, and in fact he gets up on this hill called Poklonnaya Gora, or bow down hill in Russian, and it's basically where traditionally the Russian faithful would sort of bow down and sort of pay their obeisance to the mother city whenever they entered. And it was there when the French troops first got their first sight of Moscow, and they were all shouting, "Moscow, Moscow!" And they must have thought, the end is nigh. We're here. Victory is to be ours. Napoleon himself was just sitting there, waiting for a delegation of the Muscovite city authorities to basically surrender the keys of the city to him on a pillow. And eventually, he sends some staff officers to Moscow to inquire, and they find that the city is completely empty. And Napoleon's like, right,
I don't know what to do now.
This doesn't smell right. He's like, okay, it's too late. I'm not gonna go into the Kremlin right now. I'm just gonna go back to my quarters at the Petrovsky Palace, and we will enter triumphantly into Moscow the following day. And on the morning of the 16th, the Napoleon and his guard march through, and they turn onto the Kremlin and march in triumph to the sound of La Victoire est à nous, ours is the victory, which is one of the more popular marching songs of the French army back then.
Played by the bands of the Imperial Guard.
Indeed. So Napoleon wanted to sort of create a sort of triumphal scene, like this conqueror,
into this amazing city,
into this beautiful city full of onion domes,
glistening gold in the sunlight,
and I think it would have been unlike pretty much any other city Napoleon or the French army would have seen. Napoleon's been around. He's been to Egypt and Syria. But I think Moscow also had this sort of exotic allure of the sort of Eastern allure that Napoleon wanted, and to sort of just march into the Kremlin, I think would have been a great day for him. And he thought, well, let's just wait here and wait for Tsar Alexander to come begging for his city back.
Because he couldn't quite believe that he just got it, did he? Because he couldn't believe that these, he called them barbarians, were just going to leave this city to an invader. And he asked Master of Horse Caulaincourt, "What do you think?" And Caulaincourt, who has been a critic of this entire escapade from the beginning, just sort of looked at him and said, "Your Majesty knows exactly what I think," and didn't say anything more.
And bear in mind, from the earliest days of the campaign, Caulaincourt, even before the campaign, Caulaincourt was basically saying, Tsar Alexander is going to retreat as far as he can to the edge of the world, and he's not going to make peace with you, sire. And yet, Napoleon...
Here we are. Yet here we are.
But in any case...
Something happens now, something very dramatic, and it happens quite fast. It's unbelievable how the passage of events that have just happened.
So Napoleon's sort of settled down in the Kremlin. I think he goes to the Terem Palace, which is a sort of part of the older part of the Moscow Kremlin. He sits around for a bit, and he's like, Does anyone smell burning? Maybe Berthier, can you check the oven?
If you can find the kitchen, tell me something's burning.
After a while, you look out the window, and it turns out the whole skyline, the whole horizon, is basically a streak of red.
It does not get better, does it?
and you're kind of feeling the heat now. And Napoleon's like, okay, I guess it's not really safe for us here. So let's get back to the Petrovsky Palace. Let's try and get this inferno under control.
So Napoleon believes that the Russians have burnt the city, doesn't he? Pretty much.
Right. He basically is like, these barbarians. How can they burn such beautiful city? Right.
But the most important thing is he needs to try and put the fire out.
Right. And
Problem number 2.
It takes a good 3 days for the French to get control of the situation. Unfortunately, by the time they do so, 2/3 of Moscow has been burnt to a crisp. This is not good news for Napoleon's army. Bear in mind, he still has a fairly large a number of men with him, about 90,000. And all these men kind of need places to stay and sleep. He's now really unable to cater for them because much of the city is just being gutted.
Indeed, it is a blackened cinder, most of it, because most of it is also made of wood.
Right.
And the fire engines that should have been around were no longer there. So the troops he sent to fight the fire couldn't do it.
Right.
Because, why is this, Jimmy?
Because
now we get into some theories about who is responsible.
Because our good friend, Governor General Fyodor Rostopchin, having evacuated the city, he also evacuated the fire service. And not only did he do that, he basically let all the criminals free, because he evacuated all the authorities keeping prisons. That sort of situation is rather conducive to things happening, because when you let several thousand criminals on the street, when you've got a completely abandoned city, I think there's going to be quite a lot of looting going on and destruction.
And this is quite apart from the fires already set by the retreating Russians in certain depots and places where they needed to burn supplies, which I believe they left to the Cossacks.
Indeed, the Cossacks were given the job of burning stuff, and we love the Cossacks, but let's be fair, they don't really keep control of situations very well.
Oh, they can get carried away a little. These colliding factors.
Burning a few supplies, and things get a little out of control, and you got no one to put out the fire. What can you do? So Rostopchin, he may not have given orders for Moscow to be set on fire. He created the conditions for Moscow to burn really easily.
Yes.
And not only that, he had actually set fire to his own estate. And he's a very interesting chap, because he, for most of his life, he was a Francophile. He spoke French. He loved French culture. This mansion that he built was essentially, just full of French stuff. And then Napoleon invaded, and Rostopchin, maybe for personal reasons, maybe for political reasons, basically turned to like a bigger Francophobe than Nigel Farage.
Which is rich, because rich and completely probably commonplace, because so much of the Russian aristocracy was probably more French than the French, in a way.
A lot of them grew up speaking French. They understood that French was the fashionable language to speak at court, and the vast majority of them, definitely those in Petersburg, perhaps some of them in Moscow as well, were certainly better at French than they were at speaking Russian. And actually, it was during this time when they found a use for their household serfs, because they found that they had a good supply of native Russian speakers around them. Who could teach them. And this sort of topsy-turvy world where you had these serfs teaching their masters how to speak Russian.
Yes, which is just brilliant in its own way, little way. But so now we have the capital in flames. What does Napoleon do with this, and what happens next? Because his main goal first was to destroy the Russian army. Failing that, we have pretty much said his idea was to take Moscow and negotiate.
He's in Moscow. The fire is basically out now. He goes back into the Kremlin, and he starts sending peace feelers to Alexander. My dear brother, I am currently sitting in your beautiful Kremlin. Would you like it back? Surely you do not countenance me being here for long. Why not? Let's, like we did at Tilsit, let's rebuild the bromance we had at Tilsit. And he sends a couple of missives to St. Petersburg. And Alexander, like any good ex, basically is like, I'm not replying to this dude.
There's two cities that there's a direct consequence of you being in my country no longer exist practically.
Many of my subjects have suffered considerably as a result of your actions. And so Alexander essentially just ignores him. Napoleon is now rather frustrated. We're now moving into mid-October, and he decides to roll the dice once again, and he asks General Lauriston to find Kutuzov, because the French don't really know where the Russians are, and eventually he does, to the south of Moscow. She basically says, "Why do you want this war to carry on for any longer?" And essentially playing the political card.
Yeah.
And Kutuzov listens to him very politely, but he just says, I hear you, but I don't have the authority. The Tsar has not given me the authority to do any peace negotiations. Why don't you write a letter to the Tsar? Or, what we can do is you could write a note here, and we will send someone to bring it to the Tsar. You'll hear back within 24 to 48 hours.
Working days.
Yeah. 7 to 10 working days. Obviously, Kutuzov has absolutely no inclination of sending anything to the Tsar.
No.
And
News for Lauriston.
Lauriston basically goes back to Napoleon, has an interview with him in one of the Kremlin churches, or at least that's how it's depicted in Vasily Vereshchagin's painting. And basically, you've got Lauriston with his head down saying, "No can do, I'm afraid." And Napoleon basically looking at him like,
"Everybody, I hate everyone."
"I find myself in a bit of a pickle here. There's no more we can do. We need to get the hell out of here." But again, where does Napoleon go? Does he try to go east? Does he try to penetrate further into Russia? Does he go to St. Petersburg? Does he go south? Well, as Field Marshal Kutuzov very presciently surmised, Napoleon had to go south because south is where the supplies are and where the food is, and where he may be able to find some horses even.
Well, that would be nice, wouldn't it?
So Napoleon decides to turn south, and he gets Murat with the vanguard to try and sort of poke around and see where the Russians are actually encamped. Murat's vanguard, they go towards a place called Tarantino, which is where they think Kutuzov is, and Kutuzov sees them coming. He's got Cossacks.
Yeah.
They know they're coming. And the Cossacks basically say, we've got some movement, and it seems to be more than patrols. And Kutuzov, being the wily fox he is, says, "Well, let's try to surprise them." And
I have a cunning plan.
Department of Cunning at Oxford University or something.
Is he a professor of cunning from Oxford University?
Kutuzov's cunning plan is to split his army into two columns, with General Bennigsen, his chief of staff, leading the larger one, and then with Miloradovich basically sort of taking a parallel route and essentially sort of being in a position to launch a surprise attack. Bennigsen basically clobbers the French vanguard. Unfortunately, during this action, the commander of the Russian Second Corps, General Bagavut, is killed. But nevertheless, we've smashed Murat, and essentially the Russians now have the initiative. So Napoleon finds out about Murat, but he basically decides, well, we've got to try something. We've got to try to break through to the south. And the units who try to do that, Eugene's Fourth Corps, the Army of Italy, basically go south, try to break south onto the Kaluga Road. So Eugene has around 24,000 men with him. He gets to this town called village, town, depends on your interpretation.
Yeah.
He gets to this place called Maloyaroslavets, which is blocking the road down to Kaluga, because Kutuzov is aware that something is going on, that Napoleon is trying to break through to the south, and he's sending forces to intercept it. So he manages to get 12,000 men under General Doktorov to block the path. More men are funneling through. So you've got Raevsky is on his march, and Kononitsin as well. You know, they're trying to assemble en masse at Maloyaroslavets, which is where they intend to make a stand against Napoleon's army trying to break through. So, with this being the case, and with only Doktorov's men being at Maloyaroslavets, Yushin tries to take the position before the Russians get more reinforcements. So he sends part of his corps under General Alexis Delzon, and they're the first in, and they manage to actually take control of the position. There's quite a lot of bloody fighting, especially around this monastery, which is on the sort of northern part of the town. But eventually, and the Italians, they fight like lions.
This is the pride of the army of Italy here that goes down very well back across the army. Everybody's incredibly impressed with them.
Yeah,
it's interesting, just as a nugget, that the army of Italy does not cry "Vive l'Empereur"; they shout "Viva Italia" when they go into battle.
And the Italians, they do a great job, but then the Russians have reinforcements under Raevsky. With the addition of Raevsky's troops, the numbers are basically even now, and Raevsky's men managed to retake Maloyaroslavets, push the Italians out, and as part of this, Delzon is killed. So then you get a bit of a to and fro. General Kononitsin is also bringing up the Russian rear, but the French manage another assault, and finally manage to secure Maloyaroslavets, despite the fact that they are now outnumbered. And at this point, it's getting really late now. It may be like sort of 9-10 p.m. by this point. Kutuzov is pretty much at the scene. He decides, let the French have Maloyaroslavets. Let's not contest it. Let's just stand on this ridge to the south. And basically, you know, what makes this sort of so imposing is because that is the way that the French will have to go if they're trying to break through to the south. So you've got essentially a wall of Russians up on this ridge, up on these heights. Napoleon basically thinks about it and is like, well, even though my brave Italians have done a great job here, in order to break through, we will need another Borodino, and we cannot afford another Borodino. And Napoleon basically decides there is no point in trying to break through, and decides to turn back north. And the only avenue of retreat now is back to the way he came, through Borodino, through Smolensk, the war-torn, completely ravaged territory.
Because what we didn't say in the previous videos is that from Smolensk to Borodino, the Russians had been actively burning practically everything that could possibly sustain life.
Right. And the French, on their advance, managed to get the rest. It's now completely empty, frozen wasteland, really, because it is now beginning to snow, and we're now the famous Russian winter is beginning to show itself. And interestingly, Kutuzov does not immediately pursue Napoleon. He gets some Cossacks to pursue the French, and actually they come very close to taking Napoleon captive.
Yes, yes, they do. Apparently, and Napoleon was up early as usual, going on a tour of pretty much the positions, And the Cossacks, obviously being Cossacks, they're a law unto themselves, and they could be anywhere pretty much, which is part of the thing that the French are terrified of. They see this body of troops, and it's small, and for Cossacks, let's go, boys. And there's a
small isolated body of troops. Let's get our glory.
Yeah.
And let's cut them all down. And
little did they know.
Little did they know that this small body of troops turned out to be, Napoleon and his staff, and essentially the cream of the Grande Armée.
And there's a brief swirling sort of scrap of sabers and lances as even Napoleon's staff and marshals who are in attendance have to draw their swords and fight off the Cossacks. And I think actually Napoleon is bundled off somewhere. He's quickly taken off into like a ditch or something, or he has to ride for safety while the chasseurs of the Imperial Guard and his generals try and chase off the Cossacks. Yeah.
And so eventually Napoleon and indeed his marshals managed to escape, but it's quite a hairy moment.
It was, and it's cited quite a lot in histories of the retreat, that this had a great effect on Napoleon, as well as seeing the devastation at Maloyaroslavets with all the burnt bodies and crushed corpses from wagons going down the road and things. And unusually, it's reported that this bothered him a great deal. Whether it's the dead bodies or other Cossacks, we won't know.
And I may be mistaken, but I think Napoleon also had some poison prepared in case he found himself in a similar situation again.
I heard that too. I don't know when he did it though.
But
it must have been around this time, sure.
Right. It's quite clear that he didn't want to find himself the captive of the Cossacks.
Not want to be brought before General Platov.
Well, yes, General Platov at first, and then
would have gone up the line, but I think Platov would have got him first if the Cossacks got him.
I'm sure Platov would have managed to get a piece of the action. Look at prancing about. Look at me. Look at my Cossacks managing to capture the emperor.
Yeah.
And then he would be passed on to Kutuzov, possibly, and Kutuzov would have had a field day, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Revenge for Austerlitz. In any case, Napoleon has narrowly escaped, not for the last time, and then Kutuzov does not immediately pursue, because he's basically of the opinion, well, if they're just going back, then why we should just let them be, essentially. And
because he's got a not unreasonable caution about what I think Dominic Bevin calls the élan and fighting spirit of the French army on the field.
He's still a little cautious that this French army, despite being in tatters, can still fight very bravely, as they demonstrated at Maloyaroslavets. And Kutuzov didn't really want to risk more men, really. I mean, as far as he was concerned, strategic victory was already in the Russians' hands, and he just had to shadow the French army back across the Niemen. He was happy enough with just getting them across the Niemen, out of Russian territory, and he would have been happy to go back to St. Petersburg. And it's actually, as an interesting addendum aside to Kutuzov's decision to basically just sort of make a stand but not to pursue. I don't know whether the Russians would have considered it in the same way, but it reminds me of the great stand at the river Ugra in I think it was around the 1480s, when this was the time when the Russians finally threw off the yoke of the Tatar. And what happened was basically you had these two armies, the Muscovite army and the Tatar army, and they were just facing each other across this river. And there were a few skirmishes on either side, a few attempts for the Tatars to try and break through, but nothing particularly major. and then they both sort of stayed in their camps. And like a month or two later, the Tatars, now again short on supplies, basically decided to retreat, and the Muscovites, seeing there was no real reason to pursue, also decided to retreat. And there was, it's like this great moment in Russian history when 200 years of Mongol oppression had been overthrown.
Mm-hmm.
But there was no sort of great battle or anything. It's just two sides meeting each other across a river, and both deciding to bugger off after.
And the one with the best supply, like.